This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com. This chapter, as you can see, is about risk management. There's quite a lot here, so I will split into two lectures, but also I want to talk through the general thrust of it and stress the more important bits, but you must read all of this in detail yourself. But the point is, so many things, most things in fact, that a business may do involve an element of risk. If you're thinking of launching a new product, for instance, clearly there is a risk as to whether the product will do well or the product will do badly. And it's important we manage risk, we identify risks, we know what the risks are, and we try and reduce them to the extent we can. And it's not to say we won't take risks. As long as we keep in control of it, can be a source of competitive advantage. If we're never going to take a risk, we never would launch a new product. And the greater the risk, potentially the greater the rewards. But we've got to know about the risks we're taking. We've got to think about it, decide whether it's worth taking the risk, and to what extent we can perhaps manage the risk. And further down, it says CIMA's suggestions about risk management. The steps we should take, we should identify the areas in the business where there are risks. We should identify all the risks. It says all types of risks should be considered. Have risk workshops, benchmarking, consultations with our stakeholders, shareholders and whoever. But to go through and identify all the risks that exist. It mentions having a risk register. Again, we need to be really methodical. Area through the business. Identifying, listing, recording all the risks. We need to determine a risk management policy. What's our risk appetite? What that means is how much risk are we actually prepared to take in general? Are we very cautious and not prepared to take many risks at all? Or are we obviously prepared to take more risks? But how much risk in general are we happy to accept? That very much depends on the type of organisation, the industry and so on. We then need to look at what our responses are to the risk. Now, we'll go through something called the TARA framework later, but there might be some risks which we're just not prepared to take. We avoid them completely. Other risks, we might decide, perhaps a very small risk, we might just decide to accept them and not worry about them, but others, we look for ways of actually managing them. And we need to report on these risks. Report how much risk there is, how much risk we're managing to control, how much residual risk there is, the risk that's left there, but we need to report on it properly. And you've got that sort of flow chart there, the risk management cycle, where it goes round and round in that we establish the risk management group and set goals. So we need a group of people who are doing this for us. Set our goals. What is our risk appetite? They're going to identify the risk areas. We need to understand and assess the scale of the risk. Is it high risk, low risk, big consequences, minor consequences? We need a strategy for how we're going to respond to all the risks that have been identified. And we need to implement it. And when I say it goes round and round, we need to monitor how well are we managing the risk, review it, refine it, and go again. It's not just a one-off exercise. And all of it leads in to the actual decisions we make. Are we going to launch the new product? Aren't we? And so on. The types of risk, upside down risks, downside risks. Risk doesn't always mean things are going to collapse. But upside risk, things might get better. Downside risk, things might get worse. And the categories of risk, there's no precise list. These are just various types of risk that stand to occur. And many risks might fall into several categories. But these are all examples of types of risk. Strategic risk. That's things like I mentioned, launching a new product. That's a new strategy, but there's a risk. Will it be successful or not? Operational risk. Poor operational processes, things that might go wrong there. Market risk. Factors that might affect the whole market in which we operate and therefore affect us clearly. I've jumped over one, sorry. Product risk. The individual products might do well or badly. Credit risk. Our credit rating, there is a risk for every business, and it may be harder to raise finance. But this is what I mean by identifying where there's a risk and then deciding shortly, perhaps using this TARA, but how big a risk is it that our credit rating might be affected? How big an effect would it have on us if it was affected? Liquidity risks, the risk of not being able to meet debts. Technology risks, due to technological change. Political, legal, regulatory risk. Again, depends very much on the type of operation we run, but regulations might change. Environmental risk. Reputational risk. Not something that's going to be easy to measure, obviously, but areas of risk. Have something damaging our reputation, the same damaging product reputation. Commodity price risk. Prices, clearly, whatever resources we buy, risk that prices may increase. Contractual inadequacy risk. But we've got contracts, but the terms might not meet all potential outcomes. Risk that we've got a problem. Fraud risk, of course, and employee risks, including, employee error. This is what I meant when, it takes time and it's important to identify all the risks that exist. However obvious it may be, there's always a risk of employees making a mistake. We need to identify that that's a risk. We need to think about how likely is that to happen, how big an impact would it have on us if it did happen. Of course, different levels of employees, different types of employees, the likelihood and the impact of it may well be different. Risk assessment. This is this TARA thing, and I'll jump straight to the matrix there. That's one way of approaching it. Is as we identify risks, I just mentioned about employee error, we need to think how likely is it that there'll be employee errors, and even if there is, how likely is it to impact heavily on us? And so what would be ideal is for all our risks that have been identified to look at the probability of it happening. Is it high probability or low probability? And again, for each of the risks, is the impact on us, the consequence of it, likely to be high impact or a low impact? And depending on the combination of the two, is it high risk and a high impact, then it goes into that box. If it's low risk, low impact, into that box, and so on. And you'll see in those boxes are what you might call the actions we might take. And so you can see for yourself, if something's like to have a high impact on us and is highly likely to happen, then perhaps we should avoid it completely. We're launching a new product, but we've decided it's very risky, and if things go wrong, there's a huge impact. Maybe then our action will be to avoid and just not launch it. That's one option available to us. At the other extreme, if it's low probability, it's not likely to happen, and even if it did, the consequences are low. I don't know, perhaps certain employees, perhaps they're very unlikely to make an error, they very rarely do, and even if they did, it's not going to be too big a problem to sort out. Well, in that case, we may not bother wasting time taking action. we may just decide to accept the risk and too bad. But the other two, if it's a high impact, if it's a low impact but a high probability, then we look for ways of attempting to reduce the risk. We'll talk about ways we might employ shortly. We'll look to see if we could reduce the risk at all. If it's highly likely but a low probability, again, I'll talk about ways in a minute, we'll attempt perhaps to transfer the risk or share the risk with other people. Now, I need to say slightly more about the reducing and transferring. I think avoiding or accepting are fairly obvious. I think I've made that clear. But before I say slightly more about avoiding and reducing, that's TARA, transfer, avoid, reduce, accept. Do learn the 4 responses to risk. That depending on the probability of the risk occurring and the degree of impact it will have on us, there are the 4 what you might call standard responses. Transfer, avoid, reduce, accept. To try and explain a little bit better, or at all, what I mean by reduce and avoid, just look at exercise 1. Birdie needs to evaluate the risks relating to a new business venture in a foreign country. So it's a new venture, it's a foreign country. They're wishing to use risk mapping and the TARA framework to formulate an appropriate response to these risks. And the question says, suggest some risks that the new foreign business venture may create. Now, we've gone on here, and obviously we don't know what the product, what the venture itself involves. We don't know what the country is. But the sort of risks we might identify, forgive me, I'll have to sort of squeeze in here rather than get a new blank page. But the sort of risks we might identify, well, it's a new product. So the fact is, whether foreign country or not, you know, it's a new product. It may not be successful, may not be popular, attractive to customers, whichever way you want to put it. So that's one risk. It's in a foreign country. Well, there's the question of how stable is the foreign country. There may be the possibility, the risk of the government taking over. You know, some countries have this policy of nationalising whatever. Clearly it's a foreign country, so the income is likely to be in foreign currency, so there's the risk of exchange rate movements. Again, a foreign country, tax rates changing. I know they change in any country, but in your home country, generally, we have perhaps a better idea of what's like to happen with tax rates. When it's a foreign country, maybe it's more uncertain. I mean, there are only suggestions, obviously. We need a lot more detail. In practice, we'd go through every area, every type of risk we could identify. Language problems. You know, if we're moving some of our staff over, or what about this? The culture. You know, different countries, our employees, presumably we've got foreign employees, the work culture, all culture is likely to be different. So workers' culture. I think you know the sort of thing I'm trying to suggest. So there's just a partial list, but you know, it's going through and looking every risk we can identify. And how are we going to respond? Now, there's no rule here, obviously, it has to be discussed. but the product may not be attractive to customers. Well, we have to assess how likely a risk was that, you know. And do we sell the same product? I've assumed a product, it says venture, business venture, so it might not be, but let's assume it's producing a new product. Maybe we already sell the product in other countries and it's very successful. Or maybe it's a completely new product that we've never sold anywhere. It's just unique to this country we're going to. And so in that case, we may say that we should avoid it completely. If we thought it was highly likely and a high impact on the consequences. And similarly, with the government taking over. I'm putting a question mark because, of course, I don't know which country it is. We don't know if there's any history of nationalising. And so we don't know how high the impact of it is. On the other hand, if you think back to that TARA framework that I had a minute ago, actually, can I wind back? I said, if there's a high probability and it's a high impact, we may decide to avoid. But I also said, if there's a high impact, which those two are, if I thought there was a low probability though, so if it's not attractive, the government take over, obviously the impact potentially huge. But if I think the probability is low, I may decide to try and transfer some of the risk. And the way we could do that, perhaps, is have a joint venture with a local company. Transferring some of the risk. We're no longer having to take all the risk. We lose some of the reward, obviously. There's the trade-off. But a joint venture with a local company. Or some sort of franchising. Again, let a local business may sell the product and so on, and we take effectively a fee. So that's what I mean. Avoid, just don't do it. Transfer, look for some way of pushing the risk away from us onto somewhere else. Now, what about exchange rate movements? There's one where, again, depending on the country, if it's a stable country, exchange rate movements, I think you'd agree, are very likely. You know, if you think between the UK and the US, movements, it's always moving. The impact's not huge, though. And so here's a risk that we'd try and reduce. And there are various ways on foreign currency markets, so things called futures and forward contracts, which I'm not going to go into in detail here. Forward contract is you fix a rate today that applies in the future. That would be a way of reducing the risk. To an extent, you may be able to remove it completely. But certainly, there are ways of reducing foreign exchange risk. Tax rates changing. Again, it's impossible to say, depends on the country. That's perhaps something that you think is unlikely. Again, if it's the US or something, I think you may think it's unlikely there'll be a sudden unexpected change in tax rates. And if there were to be fairly small. So that might be a risk you'd accept and not bother doing anything about. Language problems, workers' culture. Again, depends on the likelihood, which depends so much on the country involved, and the level of impact. They might be something you'd attempt to reduce. I'll put question marks against all of them. But maybe you can try and reduce them by, if our employees are going there need to learn the language, more training in the language. Maybe if there's could be a problem, workers work different, the culture's different, make sure we've got local managers. Potentially they want you perhaps able to reduce. So the question marks all over the place. But I hope I've got the idea across. This idea of listing every risk we can perceive, that was only a small selection. But then for each of them, depending on whether it's high or low probability of occurring, and whether the impact, if it does occur, is high or low, then those 4 basic responses: accept the risk, avoid the risk, reduce the risk, transfer the risk. Okay, we'll leave that bit of the chapter here. The next lecture, I want to talk more about ethics.